Welcome to Full Momentum and HEC-RAS Vodcast. I am your host, Ben Cary, and here joining me, as always, Chris Goodell. Chris, welcome to episode number 24. That's a pretty cool number, but even cooler than the episode number is the fact that we have crossed the 100,000 view threshold on our YouTube page. That's a pretty remarkable accomplishment, Chris.
That's pretty cool, Ben. Yeah, good to see you again. And that's really exciting. It's cool that we're able to do this. We're able to put some time into this, and we've got 24 episodes. Well, this will be number 24 right now. We only started it a couple years ago, roughly 2.5 years ago. And so I'm glad that we're able to keep this thing going. I'm glad people are watching, and we're getting a lot of good feedback too when we see people out at conferences, or when I'm teaching classes, or just bumping into people here and there. So glad to see that people are finding use out of this. It makes it all the more encouraging for us to keep this thing going. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, first of all, happy holidays, and then happy New Year to everyone who's watching this. This will probably be our last episode of 2022, and we do have some exciting things coming in 2023. So, first of all, there's likely going to be some Full Momentum and HEC-RAS podcast gear coming out next year. So be on the lookout for that. We're going to have some potentially a t-shirt or a hat, and we might send those out to folks that are interacting with us on our YouTube channel. The other announcement, which is pretty cool, is to celebrate our 100,000 view threshold. We are going to host a live vodcast on YouTube. The date for that is going to be TBD. It's going to be sometime in Q1 of 2023. So be on a lookout for that. The idea is Chris and I are going to hop on. It's going to be casual conversation just like this. We'll have a few topics that we're going to cover in background, and then if there's questions that come in from folks on the channel, we'll answer those to our best of our ability. But it'll be kind of a fun switch up of what we've done so far.
Yeah, and show up for that too. Keep your eyes out so that you see when the date and time will be, and then we're going to want to have as many people as possible to come in, and it'll be a great time to hey, you've got this lingering question. You've always kind of wondered about this with RAS, or maybe there's something weird going on with your model and you want to tell us about it. We can talk about that. Or if you just want to chat about general topics, whatever. Or if you want to ask Ben about Gonzaga, and
we will be taking Gonzaga questions.
How they're doing at the moment, and his prognostication for March Madness coming up in a few months. You can do that too. Yeah.
Awesome. And then last announcement for 2023 as we move into the new year is Kleinschmidt actually has an active listing out for a H&H internship. And that internship is going to be in the Portland, Oregon office. So if you are selected for that, you'd be working directly with Chris and I in the Portland, Oregon office, along with the rest of our awesome H&H team out here in the Northwest, and doing a bunch of different types of both water resources engineering work. It's definitely some HEC-RAS work, as well as getting the potential to go out in the field, do some things around different project sites that we have here in the Northwest, and also getting a chance to get exposed to non-water resources areas of Kleinschmidt. We pride ourselves as a company on being very multidisciplinary. And, Chris and I, even though we do a lot of H&H work, we interact with our scientists and our relicensing folks, as well as the other engineering disciplines that we have within the company. So we hope that it's a very broad experience in terms of what people get, but also going to be able to do some hardcore H&H stuff, which I think will be really, really valuable for folks. So anything else, Chris, you want to add about that internship?
Yeah, so we're just looking for people who have a passion for water resources engineering. We recognize when you're in college, when you're studying, you don't have experience necessarily. And so that's not as important to us. It's great if you can show that you've done something that's applicable, but we're looking for somebody more who has a passion and an excitement for the field, who wants to learn, who's eager to learn, because we can do that. We can do that for you at Kleinschmidt, and give you an opportunity to work with us and learn some stuff before you go back to school in the fall.
Yeah.
So it's a great opportunity and it's a win-win for both of us. So we're really excited to see who comes in, what kind of applicants we get. And hey, Ben, did you ever have an internship?
I did. Yeah. I actually interned at a transportation engineering firm. Shout out to Transpo Group up in Kirkland, Washington. It was a great experience, but ultimately, ended up in H&H, and sure glad I did because now I'm here. So did you intern ever anywhere, Chris?
Sort of. I wanted to get something between my junior and senior years, and there was nothing. I could
Okay.
not get anything. I had a few interviews. I can remember one was at Happy Valley Water Control District, or something like that, and that's in East Portland area.
Hmm.
And even went on site, had an interview, and thought it went well, and didn't get it. I was really bummed, and I really wanted to get some experience because I knew coming out of college, it's tough to get that first job. And if you have some
Hmm.
experience with an internship, that gives you a huge advantage.
Yeah.
So what I ended up doing is I volunteered. I
Oh, cool.
volunteered,
Yeah.
yeah, at the Corps of Engineers.
Hmm.
And I said, hey, look, I'll come in. You don't have to pay me. I'll do whatever you want. Just let me sit down and interact with you guys and,
Good idea.
take some
Yeah.
load off. And, I had nothing else to do that summer. I mean, not nothing else, but, I had some time. And I thought, well, if I don't have a paying job, maybe this will be the next best thing. And it turned out that got my foot in the door. The next summer, I had an actual real internship, which led to a full-time job. So it
Very cool.
started it all off for me. Yeah.
That's a great segue, Chris, because we're going to talk about things for in um, people that are interested in getting internships, things to consider, things to do, things
Yeah.
not to do. We do have also a really awesome technical topic today. So Chris is going to dive into ineffective flow areas within HEC-RAS. I know that's a topic that we've had a bunch of people ask about. So we're going to dive into that. But before we go there, let's transition back to interns, because I know that this time of year in particular, finals week, I believe, is this week. People are going to be heading
Hmm.
home for holiday break. And a lot of folks are going to be probably submitting applications for internships for this upcoming summer. So I know there's probably a lot of anxiety and people that are excited about this opportunity. So we wanted to take a minute. Back at the beginning of this podcast series, we did something similar in the spring for folks applying for jobs and new
Hmm.
college grads and things like that. So we're going to do something similar here and talk a little bit about things to do, things not to do when you're applying for and working as an intern. So the first
Yeah.
thing that came to my mind when we were thinking about this was, particularly about resumes that get submitted in for internships. And I, given that we just posted this position, I've actually already seen a number of resumes, and there are things that stand out right away about things like, oh, I'm glad that person added that to their resume, and I'm not sure that presents much value. So the first thing I'll start off, Chris, and I'll throw it to you is, you
Hmm.
know, items on your resume when you're a sophomore or junior in college that are tied to what you did in high school, not super relevant, probably not going to move the needle and separate you from other applicants. And that's really what the whole point of a resume is to separate you or add topics that people are interested in discussing further with you. And, whether you played sports in high school, what your GPA was, it's probably not going to move the needle a whole lot when somebody's looking at your resume and potentially thinking about bringing you on as an intern. So that's the first thing that popped into my head. What popped into your head, Chris, when we're talking about things
Well,
to do and not to do?
would there be a benefit to somebody telling you that they played pickleball? Now, would that get them some
Ooh,
points?
see, it would, only because that would mean that leads into another item to do, which is do a little bit of background research on the
Yeah.
company and the people that you're potentially going to be working with. Because I think,
Yeah.
Chris, what you're stating, that is true. If play pickleball, now that's a sport. Obviously, it's not going to impact your ability to do water resources engineering, but it shows that you took some time probably and researched Kleinschmidt, researched myself. Maybe you followed the Vodcast, and so that shows some initiative. And that's my second item, which is, do a little bit of research on the company that you're applying for or the people that you're going to be working with and cater your resume to them. And that's going to show that initiative, because one of the more
Mm.
important things that an intern can have is initiative. If you have initiative and if you have enthusiasm, you're probably going to have a pretty good experience as an intern. So that's another
Yeah.
one. Chris, what else stands out to
Well,
you?
I can't tell you how many resumes I've gotten over my career where there'll be a cover letter and the person will say, "Hey, I think I'm a great fit for your company." Um, blah blah blah. They talk about how great of a fit they'll be, and then it turns out that they have no water resources background at all. They're a structural engineer or something like that. And then it becomes obvious that they were just throwing out resumes, just a big wide net, which, is fine, the gunshot method, but, it's not going to, like you say, move the needle for us. So what we're looking for is passion, and excitement for the field. And if you do have some hobbies or activities that are related to water resources, maybe you're a kayaker and you want to put that on, and then in your cover letter, talk about how much you love rivers, you love getting out there and understanding the flow of water through a natural system. That stuff I like to see. I like to see stuff about the classes that you've taken and that have really interested you, that are relevant to this work that we're going to do. So tell us about that, because again, you're not necessarily going to have work experience, and that's fine. That's not a requirement for an internship, but what is a requirement in my mind is having an excitement and interest for this field. And so that's, however you can show that and demonstrate that in a resume and a cover letter, that's what we're looking for.
Yeah. Another one that pops into my head right away is experience using computer software. And it can be really any software, right? It's kind of unfair to expect that our interns are going to have used RAS quite a bit. But if you have experience working with software, troubleshooting that software, working around different bugs and issues, if you have any coding experience from school, that's obviously going to be something that you're going to want to put on. So any relevant experience to working with computer software is going to be a huge plus. Make sure that you highlight that, even if it's small. Even maybe it's just a lot of experience using Excel. Excel is something you're going to use a lot of as an intern. So that's not something to shy away from and be embarrassed that maybe is one of your more refined technological skills. So that's something that stands out to me. Chris, what's another one that, when you see folks put something on the resume that you're like, I just don't see the value in doing that. That's not a separator for me.
So something that's not a separator. You kind of mentioned like high school jobs and stuff. I would say, even jobs in college that are not relevant. Everybody's got to make some money to pay the bills and pay tuition and whatnot. And so maybe you were, I don't know, a dog walker or something, and that's great, but it's not something that we're going to care too much about. And so focus on the stuff that has to do with this internship, or whatever internship you're going for, and make sure you highlight that kind of stuff. That's what we're just looking for. Well, and here's the other thing too. I get this question from people a lot, and not necessarily for internships, Ben, but even for their first job, and they want to get into water resources engineering, and they say, "What do I need to show on my resume? What's the best thing?" And I always say, show that you have experience with HEC-RAS and HMS, and show that you can do some coding, whether it's Python or VBA. And if you don't have those skills, guess what? You can get those on your own. You don't have to take a training course. You don't have to take a class. You can literally go to the HEC website and you can self-teach yourself HEC-RAS or HMS. You can go online and there's coding academies that you can do. There's coding boot camps, things like that. Just do that. Get some familiarity. You don't have to be an expert, but that demonstrates that you've got interest enough that you're going to take your own time to teach yourself this stuff up front. And that's the kind of thing we're looking for.
Yeah, and even if that doesn't happen, even if you're behind the eight ball, maybe you haven't had time to do that, and the internship, deadline is due, express in your resume or in a cover letter that you're really excited about learning those things. right?
Yeah.
But hey,
Mhm.
I don't have RAS experience, but I've listened to some videos from Chris and Ben, and I've taken some classes that have discussed RAS, and I'm really excited about learning this important software. Because again, that goes back to that enthusiasm. Even if you don't have the skill, you'll get the skill. We just want somebody that's interested. The last thing that comes to mind for me is about the regionality of where your company is that you're applying to. We get a lot of applications from folks that don't live in our area, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's really important to note whether you're willing to both move to the area and if you expect or need some sort of housing compensation. Because a lot of times we'll get applications from folks that they appear to have a really good resume, but they're, maybe in Florida, for instance. And if we're choosing between different people, if you haven't expressly told us that you're willing to move to Oregon and you don't necessarily need a housing stipend, that might be a tiebreaker situation where we go with somebody else for an interview over yourself. So if you're available and able to do those things, make sure that you list them in the resume, because again, that's a separator when we're choosing between resumes.
Ben, would you be willing to house an intern if they agreed to do your yard work for you?
I like doing yard work, so no, I'd be less likely to have somebody live with me if they wanted to do my yard
Me
work.
too.
So, but anyway,
But
so just a couple of things
good
to
points.
consider
Yeah.
there as we move into internship application season. I'm sure again, just biggest thing I would say: enthusiasm, initiative, do some research, show what you know. Even if you haven't learned it in school, you can self-teach it. I think all these points that we've covered are all really, really good takeaways.
Yeah. And hey, here's a very easy thing to do. May take a half hour of your time is get your LinkedIn page up and running
Mhm.
and demonstrate on that how excited you are about water resources engineering
Yep.
and computer modeling and rivers and streams and things like that.
Hmm.
Link to articles about it.
Hmm.
Just even have your own personal commentary. We just want to see that, you've got that excitement, and that's one way to do it too.
Yep. Good, good. All right.
Yeah.
Well, so if you
Yeah.
haven't applied already and you're a sophomore or junior in college studying engineering, for hopefully water resources engineering, go ahead and go to Kleinschmidt's website. That's kleinschmidtgroup.com. And there's the internship posting under careers there. Send us your application. We've already got a number of applications, a number of interviews lined up. So if you're thinking about it, do it soon, because you never know how quickly that window is going to close. And
Yeah.
Chris and I are excited to work with whoever comes through.
Yeah, and if you're not looking for an internship, maybe you've already got a job, maybe you're 20 years in to your career, but you know somebody, please send this
Yeah,
to them. Yeah, share the link with them so that they
absolutely.
can get some of this info. Yeah.
Great. Well, good conversation there, Chris. Let's turn it to a more RAS focused discussion. So today's technical topic is going to be about ineffective flows. And ineffective flows, at least when you had broached the subject with me, was one of those topics that I was like, man, we could do a 3-part series on ineffective flows. There's a lot of ground to cover when it comes to this. So this first discussion might be a little bit higher level. And depending on how it goes and the type of feedback we get, maybe we'll do a follow-up and get a little bit more in depth. But I'll turn it over to you, Chris, to lead
Yeah.
the topic. And yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I want to start off with just an explanation of what ineffective flow is. Not everybody knows what it is, or maybe they're not totally sure about it. But the definition of ineffective flow, as far as how it's used in HEC-RAS, is flow that is not actively moving in the downstream direction. Now, this only applies to 1D modeling because in 2D modeling, you are computing flow in all directions. So we don't even need ineffective flow for a 2D model. But if you are building a 1D model, you need to identify areas where water is not moving in the downstream direction. The software won't figure this out for you. This is up to you to determine because 1D models only look at water moving actively in the downstream direction. So let me share my screen, give you some examples of ineffective flow. And I'll tell you, Ben, I first thing I did was I Googled ineffective flow, and just to see what would pop up, and not a whole lot of examples visually or imagery wise of
Hmm.
ineffective flow. But when I typed
Hmm.
in eddy patterns in rivers, I
Hmm.
got all sorts of websites with pictures and descriptions of ineffective flow, even though they don't call it ineffective flow. So
Mm-hmm.
this is one website that popped up, this Cali Paddler. So this is all about paddling in rivers. And this first article here is understanding eddy currents in rivers. And so you can immediately see in this figure, I'll actually get to a better one right here, that same figure. You can see where water is separating to go around this
Mm-hmm.
obstruction in the river. And then
Mm-hmm.
what happens just below that?
Mm-hmm.
You get
Those eddies. Yeah.
a shadow effect or eddies. And actually where the water, the boundary between water moving in the downstream direction
Mm-hmm.
and water circulating or not moving in the downstream direction is called the eddy line. And those of you who like to canoe or kayak in rivers are very familiar with the eddy line, because the eddy line, especially in a strong river, can flip you over in a
Mm-hmm.
second, like if you're not ready for it, and if you attack it at the wrong angle, because you've got high velocity here and essentially no velocity here. So if you're to come out of this eddy and nose into the river, it's going to spin you around, and if you got a wobbly kayak, it'll flip you over. So you got to be ready for that.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as HEC-RAS goes, what if we had a cross section right here, Ben? Right across the river, just downstream of the rock.
Yeah.
You're going to have to tell RAS that this is water not actively moving in the downstream direction, right?
Yeah.
So it takes some experience to know where that is and how far that eddy line projects away from the obstruction. So, technically where you're going to put your ineffective flow is from eddy line to eddy line when you
Yeah.
have a cross section here.
Yeah, it's funny looking at this too, Chris. The first thing, and this obviously isn't going to be a topic today, but another thing that comes to mind is just how this particular situation that this figure is showing, um, you're only going to be able to get that if you're doing 2D modeling using the full momentum set of equations, right? Because if you try to
That's right.
model that using the diffusion wave set of equations, you're going to not be able to represent those patterns. So there's
Yeah.
applications here when we talk about ineffective flow areas and the hydraulic phenomena that are associated with that. There are applications both to 1D and ineffective flow areas, which we're talking about today, but also for 2D. So just something
Yeah.
there to think
No,
about.
it's a really good distinction. One thing I wanted to ask you, Ben, is what if, okay, so we talked about a cross section right here, just below the rock. Well, what if I put one out here about where these green arrows are?
So that it looks like wait, at the downs, you said downstream?
Yeah, downstream about if my cross section was out here, what would I do with ineffective flows?
Yeah, so at that point, it looks like the flow has reestablished into normal flow patterns. So I don't believe
Yeah,
that you would have any more ineffective flows at that point.
exactly. So, according to these green arrows, it's now moving downstream. So now we have effective flow. We have flow actively moving in the downstream direction here. So cross section here would have no ineffective flow defined on it, but a cross section right through here would. And same thing on the upstream end. If I had a cross section out here before the flow has started to bend to go around the rock, no ineffective flow. But what if I had one right here and you got this flow that's going sideways? Sideways flow is ineffective flow. That's not moving downstream, right?
Yeah.
And so, so you would make a little bit of ineffective flow on that cross section just upstream of the rock. Now here you can see that eddy line, right? And this is the swift moving effective flow here. But over here, you've got the circulation pattern defined by these red arrows. And this is going to be ineffective flow over here.
Yeah.
This is effective flow. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one of the first things that comes to my mind when I'm thinking about this is, some folks struggle with drawing the ineffective flow lines and where those are. And there's obviously some guidance out there that can be a default in terms of the angle of that ineffective line coming into the expansion or contraction. But the best way to really draw those lines is if you have some photos of the area or if you have some aerial imagery of the area, you can utilize that to pull out these eddy lines, and it almost shows you exactly where the ineffective boundaries are. So when we get into some of the recommendations and whatnot, those are great if you don't have aerial imagery or photos or videos of the site, but it's always going to be better to have some site specific information to draw those in.
Yeah, and this really highlights the importance of getting out to the rivers often, whenever you can. If you're a water nerd like Ben and I are, you do this all the time, even to the displeasure of our families as we're on vacations or whatnot. Hey, let's go look at this river, and they're like, "Why another river? Why do we have to go look at that?" Well, you're studying things like that. You're getting a feel for how water separates off of obstructions, and that's exactly where ineffective flow sets up. When you have these separations off of obstructions, you can even see it here with this rock. There's a little ineffective flow zone right here. This little eddy pattern. You can sort of see it here. You can see it on the other side too, where it's separating off of this point, right? So here we've got ineffective flow here. You can see it again in this view here. He's crossing the eddy line, so you can see how he's got a wide stance so he doesn't tip over. Right? And I've done that before, by the way, Ben, in a kayak, not on a paddle board, but I think one of the first times I went kayaking, I just zipped across that eddy line. It flipped me right over so fast. So anyway, so this gives you some visual examples, but hey, get out to the river. And this gets back to the passion thing. If you're interested in having an internship with a firm like ours and you want to do water resources, you should be getting out to the river whenever you can, even if it's just to hike alongside it. You don't have to be in it, but being in it gives you a whole nother perspective on things.
Agreed.
So let me pull up I built for a demonstration here. I built a what I call a flume model, but this is just a trapezoidal flume. It's 1 kilometer long, but the length is really irrelevant. It's just a trapezoidal channel, right? And so with nothing in here, it just flows straight through. Pretty boring stuff. But what if we wanted to simulate bridge embankments? And so you've got this embankment on the left side and on the right side, and you've got water that's going to be coming downstream, and it's going to contract to go through that opening and then expand out again. And we would expect to see flow in these corners that is not actively moving in the downstream direction. So let's take a look at that. So here we've got flow that's squeezing through here. And if I turn on my particle tracing, you'll be able to see that a lot better. So there you can see how it's contracting to go through that opening and expanding at the downstream side. You can even see some eddy patterns right here. Okay, so here's the eddy line, right? And so here's the contraction. You don't really see a distinctive eddy. Sometimes you'll see a small one in this corner here, but it's able to contract more efficiently because it's a little bit slower on the upstream side. And so usually your contraction zone is a much shorter distance than your expansion zone on the downstream. A good rule of thumb that Ben and I use is 1-to-1 contraction rate and a 2-to-1 expansion rate. That's a pretty common rule of thumb that people use, but really all bridges are unique. All flow obstructions, all contractions, expansions are unique in rivers, so you need to really decide for each case. But knowing nothing else, a good approximation would be a 1-to-1 and a 2-to-1. And you can kind of see that, right? You can kind of see that 1-to-1, 2-to-1 thing going on.
This is a more kind of academic visual of that, right? So Chris's is much more practical with that 2D model, but this is, I think, maybe directly from the HEC hydraulic manual. But this is
Appendix B.
The 1-to-1 slope on the upstream side of this bridge opening here, and then 2-to-1 on the downstream side. And again, this is approximate, so this is a good starting point, but it's also it highlights how every single project, every single location that you're putting in Ineffective is going to be slightly different. You might have some skew to the bridge. There might be some blocked areas in the middle of the river channel here that change what those slopes are. But this is a good starting point if you have nothing else, and if you don't have the 2D model that Chris is showing here. So the other thing I wanted to show too is Chris had that visual example of the rock in the middle of the stream and how that's a blocked obstruction that creates its own ineffectives. Here's another example where we have a culvert, right? So flow is moving from upstream to downstream here. And this isn't a blocked obstruction, right? This is actually the primary conveyance area here, but this is the downstream side of that. And so in this case, your expansion contraction lines and your ineffective flow lines would be somewhere out here. And you can see how much calmer the water is here. It's not really actively conveying downstream compared to the middle here. So this is just another kind of visual example of what we're talking about.
You can almost see the ineffective flow in this image, right?
Yeah, if you were to go draw in a line here to represent that, it'd probably be change the color here so it's a little bit easier to see. Something like that on the downstream side. It's a little bit skewed just simply because of the fact that we're at a kind of an angle of the image here, but it almost looks something along those lines there.
Yeah.
Something like that.
I might even swing it out more because you can kind of almost see what looks like current down there.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
And
swinging out. Yeah,
this
like
kind of
that.
gets into the mess of trying to represent this linearly with a single line. And Chris, I'm
Mhm.
going to have you go back to your image and show this because it isn't a straight line expansion, right? There's almost some curvature to it. Like if we just draw the line to here, you can see that's pretty representative. But then as we get further out, you actually want to bring this line out, maybe closer to something like that. And so, Chris, if you want to reshare your screen and show that image that you had, I think that does a good job of illustrating that that's not a straight line. The approximation that we have is good, but it is more complicated than that, and this 2D model shows that.
Yep. Yeah, it bends like this on both sides. There's curvature to it, but we usually will. I mean, if you have multiple cross sections through here, then you can try and simulate that curvature, but most of the time we just approximate a straight line through here, 2-to-1 expansion, 1-to-1 contraction up here. So this would be an issue if we were to make a 1D model out of this. Or maybe we didn't even have a 2D model. We were just starting with a 1D model. And we had cross sections upstream and downstream of this bridge and, going both directions. You would want to define this eddy line or the ineffective flow zone with your ineffective flow triggers. Okay. Now, in the 4 cross section setup that's commonly used for bridges, you would have one cross section on either side of the bridge, really close to it. And then you'd have a cross section upstream where flow first begins to contract. So probably about right here. And that's what that 1-to-1 will define. And then you want a cross section downstream that is where flow has finally expanded out to the full width, which is about like right to here. And so that's where you get the 2-to-1. That's at a minimum the number of cross sections you need around a bridge. That's the 4 cross section model, but you can have intermediate ones in there. You would just define that expansion, or in this, the expansion of flow here or contraction on the upstream side. So what about a case, Ben, where if the water gets high enough, it starts overtopping the bridge?
Yeah, so in that case, first of all, it will drastically change your ineffective lines. And in some ways, it'll completely get rid of them. And that's when we talk about the nuances of applying ineffectives, one of the more important things is to decide or to know what the flow level is that you're modeling, because these ineffective lines change, and they can change pretty drastically depending on what the flow level is. It's really one of the, when we talk about advantages of 1D and 2D and how those two different types of modeling software are kind of beginning to separate themselves. One of the real advantages of 2D is the fact that as the flow level changes within your model boundary, your geometry, your underlying terrain data, and the way you have your mesh set up is going to automatically take into account how those ineffective areas change and don't change. 1D model is going to be a lot more limited. You're going to have to be a lot more interactive with it to really represent that appropriately.
Yeah, exactly. So that's huge benefit for 2D modeling. But if you are doing a 1D model, you want to make sure that you know the elevation at which the ineffective flows will turn off. So if we go back to the low flow example, here we've got it squeezing through the opening, but as water increases in both flow and stage, eventually it's going to get high enough to go over this embankment. And that's what we're showing right here on this example. And so you would want to know, okay, what elevation does it start to overtop? And a good first estimate is, let's turn on this profile line here so you can see what we got. Once water gets to the deck level, then you would want your ineffective flows to turn off. So you would put an ineffective flow trigger here and here, just outside of this opening. And you would call all of this over here ineffective flow, both on the upstream and downstream side. But once the water goes over the top, then those ineffectives will turn off because we have the trigger elevation set at the same level as the crest of the embankment, which is 20 meters in this case. And so that's how you set your elevations for your ineffective flows, is when do you think that flow is going to become effectively moving downstream? That's when you want that elevation or that trigger to turn off. So that's how you set the elevation for it.
So we've talked about how those lines converge towards your contraction or towards your blocked obstruction. We've talked about the elevation of the ineffective flow area and when that, more or less turns off and flow starts to convey. One other thing I want to touch on really quick, Chris, if you go back to that visual you were just looking at, is the idea of permanency with an ineffective flow area. So if you open up that line you just had.
You're talking about this one?
The profile line that showed the water surface elevation compared to the terrain. So if you look at this, like Chris noted, at a certain elevation, in this case, right around 20 meters, the upstream area is all of a sudden going to be starting to convey flow towards this bridge opening, and so your ineffective area is going to be eliminated at that point, unless you assign that ineffective flow area to be what's called permanent within the HEC-RAS software. And I know there's a lot of questions. It's one of the biggest. The most frequent question that I get is, do you use permanent or non-permanent ineffective flow areas for an example just like this? And it depends on a lot of things. That's what I always tell folks. The most important thing is, what's the distance between your last cross section where you have ineffective flow areas and that structure that is causing the ineffective flow area? Because if that cross section is right up against, maybe just a few feet or a few meters from the bridge deck or from these abutments, it's reasonable to assume in that case that the ineffective flow area that you have there is permanent, which means if you have a permanent ineffective flow area, all of the area in this case that's being blocked by those abutments remains ineffective. But any area that's above that, any water that's above this abutment deck in this case, would be effective. So it's kind of combining the two. And that's a realistic picture, because if you were, for instance, to swim underwater up against a bridge deck that's being overtopped, that water below the top of the bridge deck really isn't effective. It's not moving through that bridge deck. It's only the water moving over the top that's actually effective. However, the opposite case, where that cross section is actually further away from the bridge deck, you might have that entire water column that is suddenly becoming effective if you're overtopping that bridge. So any other thing you want to add there, Chris, or thoughts about permanency?
Let me, I always like to explain this with a sketch. So I've got a sketch going here. And so here are the two cases that Ben was just talking about. So this is profile view, water's moving this direction on both of these examples. This is the bridge embankment where we've got vertical walls, embankment walls, and here's one where we've got sloped embankments. Now, where you're going to want to put your cross section, let's make our cross sections green, is for this case, I mean, for both cases, you want to get them as close to the the bridge, or whatever
the start of the structure.
As possible. And in this case, we've got all this embankment here, so we would want to put it near the toe of the embankment on both sides, right? All right, so, that's a bad cross section. But you get the picture. So again, this is profile view, so we're looking sideways at it. Now, if I were to draw the flow lines, okay, in this first example, you got flow lines that are going to kind of do this, right? It's going to be something like that, right? So all of this over here is ineffective flow, but just kind of in a sideways perspective versus plan view perspective. So in these cross sections that I have here, these two green ones, that's even though it's overtopping the embankment, this is ineffective still. So we would call that permanently ineffective.
Mm-hmm.
Now in the case down here,
Mm-hmm.
if we go back and draw our flow lines again, they're going to look pretty similar, right? But because of the position of the cross section, we won't have permanent ineffectives on there.
Yeah.
They'll actually, as soon as it starts to overtop, you would want to make these non-permanent, so they would turn off, because all of this, the entire water column, would be activated.
Yeah.
Does
So
that
if
kind of capture what you were talking about, Ben?
exactly, Chris, this is beautiful. I have a couple things to add here. So on that upper figure, go ahead and draw another cross section upstream that we would have the ineffectives as non-permanent. So just far enough upstream and just far enough downstream. So exactly there. And then if you draw another one downstream. So in this case, both the cross sections that are right up against the structure and the cross sections that are a little bit further out, those both might have ineffective boundaries or ineffective areas drawn on them before that structure begins to overtop. But once that structure begins to overtop, now all of a sudden those outside cross sections are going to be non-permanent. So those are going to see active flow when that's overtopped. And then the interior cross sections, because of the shape of the structure they're representing, are going to remain permanent ineffectives. And so this does a good job of highlighting how that changes versus, again, if you look at the lower figure, all your cross sections, both right at the toe of the structure as well as ones upstream and downstream, those would all be non-permanent ineffective flow areas. So this is a great visualization.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to point out, which is fascinating, Chris, I didn't think about this until you literally drew it right here. You said that this was looking in the side view and that it's non-plan view in terms of the ineffectives, and how that the red kind of circle area that you drew in represents the areas that are non-conveyant. But if you actually flip this and you pretended that that was the abutment, and we're looking at it from vertically, it's the exact same. And so that contraction of flow moving over the top of this weir in this case is almost the exact pattern that you would see of flow contracting through a bridge opening from above. So really, no matter the perspective that you look at it, you still kind of get that similar ineffective area, either right up against the structure if we're looking at it into the page, or on the upstream side as water conveys through that contraction. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is So you get both vertical and horizontal contraction and expansion of flow. And we need to account for that in RAS because we have a 1D model. We don't have a 2D or 3D model when you're doing 1D RAS with cross sections.
Yeah.
So let me show you another example. This is the case of an obstruction in the middle of the river. Kind of the same type of thing, only here now you've got water, instead of squeezing through the middle, you have it squeezing through the outsides of the channel. And this looks very similar to that image that I showed
almost
kind of at
exactly
the beginning
the same
of the discussion, right? Let me pull this up here, right? Looks exactly the same, doesn't it? And so here again, if we were to put a cross section right upstream of this obstruction, which is what we would want to do, then we've got some ineffective flow right about in here. Same thing just downstream of that. We've got ineffective flow here, and you can see this is maybe a little more than a 2-to-1 expansion. And this is probably a 1-to-1 contraction roughly. So you could set that up too on those cross sections, just like you did with the bridge.
Yep.
Now, last thing I want to get into is a little bit more advanced discussion on ineffective flows and certain applications. So with that, I'm going to get back into my my canvas here, do some painting. So let's get rid of all this stuff. And I'm going to draw a plan view of a river. So we'll make this brown because that represents the banks. And so here we go, plan view of the river. And let's say we got some kind of feature that sticks out here like this, and it comes back around and goes downstream. This is what you might call a backwater slough, right? And we're going to have some cross sections all throughout. The water's going this direction. Okay, so let's put some cross sections. I'll put one here. Oops, I just drew it the wrong direction. I'm so embarrassed. Let's do it the right direction.
You'll get a negative flow on that one, Chris.
There we go. Yeah, left to right is if you're looking downstream. Okay, so this is how I would draw these. Make sure you want to capture that point with that
Mhm.
feature. Maybe you got another one here and then another one right before it ends, and then another one right after, and then keep going downstream, right?
Yep.
And so this inside of these brown lines is all water, and you've got water actively moving downstream. But if the water's low enough that there is a barrier to flow right here, then you'll get water up here, but it's just going to be stagnant water. It's called backwater, right?
Mhm.
That's why it's called a backwater slough. And so on these cross sections, I would want to define this as ineffective flow right here and here and here.
Yeah. So do you want to draw those locations where you would put those ineffective points on these cross sections?
So we'll make our ineffectives in this case orange, and I would put ineffective right there. Oh, let me do something different here. I'm gonna make them nice and thick so you can see it. Okay, put some ineffective. Oh my gosh, I messed that up. There,
you can go control
there, and there. Yeah, I think you get the picture.
Yep.
Right. So those are my ineffective zones, and I would do these with probably blocked ineffectives, or I don't know. You could probably have it go all the way across, if this ground is high enough. So those are my ineffectives. But what about the case where water starts to get a little bit higher, Ben, and now it's doing this? It's not only going downstream, but it's also coming in like this.
Yeah. So
Now
that would be again a case when we talk about setting those ineffective areas. It's going to be based on identifying that that's a backwater slough. So the location that you have is perfect, Chris. The only other thing to consider is the elevation that you have those at, right?
Exactly.
So we're going to want to tie those elevations in with the elevation of the ground just upstream of that cross section. So I don't know if you want to draw kind of maybe a red line along that ground feature where you'd want to pull that elevation from to establish the elevation of those ineffective flow areas. So it'd be right along there, exactly.
Something there, take your best guess, but the reality is you're going to run the model and then you're going to come back and check, because what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to see when does water first start going over this high ground feature, and whatever the water level is at these cross sections when it first starts doing it, that's how you would set the elevation of these non-permanent ineffective flows.
Yep. And the only other thing I want to add to this particular image is one of the things that I see when I review models from people, which is oftentimes people will just go ahead and add that high ground peninsula that you have there. They'll just add that in as a levee with the assumption that, hey, water's not getting over there, particularly if that's not a backwater slough. Maybe it's just a low valley or whatnot behind there. And they add levees there to restrict water from getting over there. But that is it's problematic, because if water gets high enough to overtop that high ground feature there, you're not going to be accounting for the fact that now all of a sudden that area is effective in terms of what the flow is. So,
so let's draw your example, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So here we have this low area over here, right?
Yeah.
And this high ground, and this could be a levee, it could just be natural high ground here. And we've got our cross sections right here. Oh, I drew it backwards again. Oops. Oh well. So embarrassing. Here's our cross sections, right? And then we got more upstream and downstream. And sometimes this is even lower than the invert of the main channel. I've seen that happen before. It gets a little bit weird. But before water goes over the top of this, we would not expect to see water in here unless there was like groundwater seeping in, right? But you would not expect water to be able to flow in here from the river until it overtops that. And so, Ben, what you were saying is, in that case, we should put, we'll just call this my symbol for levee markers, although in RAS it's a pink triangle. But anyway, so we would want to put levee markers here, and what that would do is that would prevent water from going over into this area until the water on this side gets higher than these levee markers. Then it's able to spill over there.
That's one way to do it. But my caution with that is oftentimes people will put levees there thinking that water's not going to get over into that low area until the water overtops that levee or that bank, but they don't look upstream. They don't look
Yeah.
upstream and see if there's a lower elevation that would actually activate that low ground feature on the right bank. And so
Yeah.
that's
Can
why I
it do
really,
that
yeah,
basically?
exactly. I really caution folks, if you're finding yourself using levees, really, I caution against it unless it's a clearly defined certified levee structure, because there's a lot of different ways that water can get in there upstream, and all of a sudden that area should be conveying water and you don't have it being represented as so. Because computationally, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, you're not going to get different water surface elevations, different depths, different velocities in the channel if you use an ineffective boundary or a levee. It's going to have the same results in the channel. The
For
only thing that
1D,
you,
yeah,
for
for
a
1D
1D
model,
result,
yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
the only difference is you're preventing water from getting over there. And unless you're sure that can't happen based on your upstream geometry, you really shouldn't be using levees. So,
Yeah, it takes some three-dimensional thinking
yeah.
here for sure, and a lot of trial and error commonly when you're
Mhm,
building these models. You don't just build it and set your ineffectives and off you go. You have to look at
mhm.
the results and make sure that you've got them set properly, not only their locations but their elevations as well.
Yep. Yeah, and then the last, I guess, last word of advice for folks on ineffectives from me would be, it kind of goes back to one of our mottos from our 1D, 2D class that we teach online, which is start simple and add detail where needed. So many times we'll get 1D models from folks that just have ineffectives everywhere, and it's just a mess. It's a mess both to
Mm,
review and it's a mess computationally. And so I would highly recommend when you're adding ineffectives in, start with no ineffectives in your model at all. Run the model, make sure it's working, and then go through and add these ineffectives where you really know they should be. Because oftentimes we'll have people drawing in tons of ineffective areas before they even run the simulation once. And then they get some errors and instability and their models crashing. And it's hard to know if it's related to all the ineffective areas or something else. So just a word of advice there. Make sure you're running your model and slowly adding these ineffectives in where you need them.
agreed. Yeah, nothing is more of a nuisance than an overcomplicated model, especially if you're reviewing it and trying to understand what the heck is going on. Here's a but just to wrap up, this is an example of, or this is the Bald Eagle Creek example. Everybody gets this with the software. It's one of the example data sets. If I zoom in over here, you can see these pink squares. I call them triangles, but they're actually squares. Those represent levee markers that we were just talking
Mhm.
about. And if you look closely, you can see some green triangles around. A lot of them are on either side of these bridges that you see here. Those are ineffective flows. So,
Mhm.
how do you set your ineffective flows? Well, there's a few ways to do that. If you go right into the cross-section editor, you can see under options, there is ineffective flow areas. And this pulls up what I would call is kind of the old school way of doing it, where you
Yep.
put in you type in your left and right stationing for
Mhm.
your ineffective flows and the elevation that goes with it. So if I wanted to put something around, say, 180 and another one around 320, and then maybe I set them both at 670 for my elevation, click OK. And they're my ineffective flows. Okay, that's saying everything to the left of this one and everything to the right of this one is going to be ineffective until the water gets above that level.
Mhm.
Unless you go in, let's double click on this. This will take us back to the ineffective editor. If I
Mhm.
turn these to permanent,
Mhm.
now they will remain ineffective even when the water is above it.
Yeah,
Okay,
so if
so
you
you
click
have,
and if you click OK, Chris, you can see the visual difference too, because I believe that area becomes hatched.
it does once you have output on
Okay,
here.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So because I haven't run this yet, it's not going to show it as hatched yet. But yeah, you're right. You're right. It will show if the water's up above it, it will show this as a green hatched out area if it's permanent. If it's
Mhm.
non-permanent and the water's above it, then that hatched area will go away as soon as the water gets above these elevations.
Yep.
So that's kind of the old school way of adding them in, and you do them one cross section at a time. There's also multiple block option here, which is gives you a little more flexibility. It also is a little bit more cumbersome to add these in.
Mhm.
So let's clear those old ones. Oops. Let's clear. Oh, it's already cleared. Okay. And then I'll show you how you do a multiple block. You put the starting and ending stationing. So let's say we'll go 50 to 100 on here. We'll use the same elevation, 670, and we'll say N for not permanent. And then maybe I want another one at 150 to 200, and we'll make this one a little bit higher. And then maybe on the other side, I've got like 350 to 420, and we'll make this even higher. And we'll put ends on all of these.
And usually you're going to do multiple blocks if you have some sort of sloped structure that you're trying to capture the slope ineffective area that you'd have. You probably wouldn't have a gap in between those two on the left unless there's a hole in your structure or something.
Yeah, that's if you're doing a structure, but these could represent other obstructions like a building. This is the shadow, like the example I was just showing you. Where did it go?
Yeah. So this is like that's a floodplain model, and you have buildings or something.
Yeah. So here's where you would use a blocked obstruction, because you wouldn't want this to be ineffective or this to be ineffective. You just want it in this one single block.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what we're seeing right here. Imagine this is a big boulder in the river, or this is a house, or whatever, something that's blocking flow. So that's how you do it in the editor, cross-section editor. But if you look at this button up here, this takes you right to the graphical cross-section editor. This is so much easier. Now, you don't have the same level of precision, but I can put in and adjust my ineffective flows. I'm already in move mode, but if I right click on here, I can add more blocks. Maybe I want to put a block here. There. Maybe I want one here. Okay, I would never propose doing this. This is crazy. But so I'm going to delete all these. I think I have to click on them. So you can do all this stuff just by clicking. Now, if I get this back to what it was, I can right click and I can go add a normal ineffective, and I just have to go boom, boom. Oops. I thought that was the left one. Got to get outside of the bank stations.
Bank stations,
yeah. So those are mine, and then I can go to the next one, and I can go boom, boom, like that. Now, again, you're not going to have the same level of precision, but it's a really quick way of setting your ineffective flow.
And the reason I like this, Chris, is if you do a side-by-side of the geometry data editor and this graphical cross-section editor, so you have both, you can quickly add them and then look at what the lines look like in the geometry data editor. So you can kind of see, hey, do I have 1-to-1 slopes on the upstream side of this contraction? Do I have roughly 2-to-1 slopes on the downstream side? And kind of adding those in quickly is a great way to get those lines in place. I don't know if you have the ability to kind of show what I'm talking about there, but if you do that and you kind of get your lines drawn in where you want them, then you can go back into the detail cross-section editor and actually adjust the elevations to what they should be after you've drawn in the lines themselves.
Yeah. So you're talking about using this plan view here to see the contraction and expansion, right?
Exactly, as you draw those in the cross-section editor.
So yeah, you could zoom in here, and let's say that we wanted to show this 1-to-1 contraction here and 2-to-1 expansion. Let's do the expansion. So I can come over here and go to graphical cross-section editor. Here's my main channel. Get into normal ineffective mode. Okay, I know it's going to be a little bit wider than the bank station, so maybe I put one here and one here.
Yeah.
Then arrow down and back up, and let's see where it shows up. There you go. So that actually turned out pretty good. What I like to do too is I like to change the color of those so they're easier to see.
Yeah.
In this case, so I'll go to edit lines and symbols, go down to my ineffective. Where is it?
Right, you see it. It's right there. It's right above the hatching.
Schematic ineffective. Yeah, and I changed the symbol color from this color to something like red. Red, well, that will look like pink. A bank station. So yeah, pink will be good. Anything that's contrasting. Yeah. And then I'll a lot of times make them bigger too. So let's do that. Lines and symbols. Schematic in effect.
It's definitely one of the biggest mysteries for HEC-RAS. If we should do an episode sometime on the mysteries of RAS decisions, because making the triangles for ineffective green has to be one of the most perplexing things. I have no idea why they did that. It's like
that's kind of weird.
You could have picked any color. But yeah, I think changing the color and getting those bigger is an awesome way to to be able to see them more clearly. And then like Chris is doing right here, so you draw those in, see that your expansion contraction, that looks great. And now you would go back into the detailed cross-section editor, Chris. So if you go back.
Let me move. I want to move this one.
Oh, okay.
You got my you got my OCD triggered here. So I gotta get, okay.
So now if you go back into the detailed cross-section editor of those cross-sections, and now you would want to adjust the elevations of your ineffective. So if you go to options, ineffective flow areas. So now you'd want to adjust those elevations based on the elevation of your bridge upstream, which is causing that contraction elevation. So it's kind of a two-step process to get the lines, the contraction expansion lines drawn in correctly, and then get the elevations correctly based off the structure information that you have. So
yeah, this one's already set at 566, 564. So a good first cut would be just to adopt those, and we'll go. You know, what was it? 566 and 64. Yeah, so you would change that to 566. 564. Now you would definitely want to run this and double check that's making sense. But this is a good first cut.
It's a lot easier to draw those in the graphical cross-section editor as opposed to trying to type in what the numbers are and guess. It's too cumbersome. So I like doing it exactly how you did it, Chris. Draw them in and then adjust the elevations later.
Yeah, take a look at this. We got one that's below ground, and that's okay. RAS will still call anything to the right of that ineffective at that elevation. So you can put them below ground. There's no problem with that. And this one looks like it might even be inside. So this one's not really going to be used. But
that particular example you're showing there would I would have another question though, which is, hey, can flow get over to the right of that, or does it have to overtop that levee looking feature before it's a good example of how adding ineffectives can kind of build on themselves from a workflow standpoint. You add them in for a structure, and then all of a sudden you realize you need to add them in for some floodplain geometry that you haven't taken into account. So it's an iterative process. It takes a little bit of time, but hopefully today's video is a good summary, a high-level summary of how ineffective flow areas work, when they're used, how to add them in, and some good things to consider when you're doing so.
Yeah. No. Yeah. So hope this helps people out comprehend a little bit better the concept of ineffective flows. It's always one of the more difficult things to teach somebody who's brand new to HEC-RAS and hydraulic modeling what ineffective flow means. But if you're still not sure, get out to the river, look for those eddy patterns, and look for those eddy lines. That's where your ineffective flows get defined. And the more you see that, you see how water interacts around obstructions to flow and how it separates off, the more you're going to be better at doing this in your models.
Yep. I'll add too, if you obviously get out on the river regardless, but another great way to kind of visualize how this is working is build 2D models. Maybe not of the site that you're trying to do, but if you have the opportunity to look at a 2D model, run the full momentum set of equations, and look at what the ineffectives are like, because that's kind of like getting out in the river. You're seeing what the physics, the hydraulic physics would result in terms of expansion and contraction for particular setups of bridges or blocked obstructions or culverts or whatnot. It's a great way to have another way to visualize that.
Yeah, that was the first thing I thought when we talked about doing ineffective flows for the podcast today as well. How can I visually demonstrate this? Oh, let's just do some 2D model stuff. So, I have this test flume that I reuse for all sorts of things. And I was like, let's just take that and I'll dump some obstructions in there and we'll see how the flow goes around it and show where the ineffectives go. So yeah, it's a great tool. If you can use it to help you define where your cross sections go and where your ineffectives go, then by all means, use it.
Cool. Well, this has been awesome, Chris. Thanks for walking folks through that. Just a couple quick reminders. Again, keep an eye out for our live Vodcast that we're going to have sometime in the Q1 of next year. It'd be great to get a bunch of people on that asking some good questions. Also, if you're interested in applying for the internship at Kleinschmidt, working with Chris and I in H&H in Portland, Oregon, make sure you get your application in as soon as you can. Anything else, Chris, before we part for the end of 2022?
I just want to wish everybody a happy new year, happy holidays to everybody out there. And keep an eye out for that swag that we're going to have soon. It's going to be awesome. I've told you this many times, and other people too, Ben, is that one of my life goals is to walk down the aisle of an airplane and see somebody with the Full Momentum podcast hat on or something.
I love it.
So wear it
Well,
proudly.
hopefully in 2023 we'll get there. But anyway,
Yeah.
thanks for everybody who tuned in today. This has been Full Momentum in HEC-RAS Vodcast. Till next time.